Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Bill McGevern, Interim Dean of the University of Minnesota Law School, and thank you to this hardy bunch of intrepid snow travelers for joining us today to hear Kashmir Hill, who is a technology reporter at the New York Times. And today we will be discussing her new book. I'm gonna do the Conan O'Brien thing here, titled Your Face Belongs to Us, a secretive startup's quest to end privacy as we know it. So I'd like to give a special thanks to Professor Matt Bodie for his proposal for today's event and for all his support, and also to Olivia Kurtz for her efforts to make it happen. So I've known Kashmir for many years after meeting her at the annual Privacy Law Scholars Conference. Neither of us is dorky at all, I promise. I was a really junior professor writing about privacy, and she was doing reporting about privacy for online publications, where she'd already made quite a name for herself as a dogged investigator who came up with kind of big scoops on the regular. So after successes at sites like Above the Law, Fusion, Gizmodo, and Forbes, Kashmir earned a ticket to the journalistic big show, joining the New York Times in 2019. At the Times, as she has throughout her career, she reports on the unexpected and sometimes ominous ways technology is changing our lives, particularly when it comes to our privacy and our data. Her work has also appeared in The New Yorker, The Washington Post, and Popular Science. That's a pretty good spectrum, to name a few. She holds degrees from Duke University and from New York University, where she studied journalism. Your Face Belongs to Us is the story of a tiny and previously unknown company that opened the Pandora's box of facial recognition, giving it to law enforcement, billionaires, and businesses, and thereby, as she says in her title, threatening to end privacy as we know it. It's been a bestseller, and it was named a Book of the Year by varied outlets, including the Financial Times, Los Angeles Times, and Wired. Today's discussion is especially important to me because, as I said, privacy is a focus of my own academic research, at least when I'm not being the interim dean. And maybe I'm a bit biased as a result of that, but I think there are few questions more important than the ones that this book raises about the future of personal autonomy, government power, and the monetization of people by the data-hungry tech industry. Here at Minnesota Law, we have experts on the relationship between the law and AI, and neuroscience, and genetics, to name a few. I'm looking forward to learning today from Kashmir about another urgent technological challenge facing the law, which is facial recognition. Before we begin, a few notes. Today's event is being recorded. After Kashmir's presentation, she and I will have a discussion, and then we'll reserve time at the end for your questions, and there's microphones on the two sides of the hall, which is important because of the recording. After the program, please join us outside for some light refreshments, and I encourage you to stop by the table set up by the university's bookstore to purchase your own copy of Your Face Belongs to Us in the event you don't already have one. Kashmir will also be available to sign books during the reception. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kashmir Hill.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you to all of you for trudging through the snow to be here. I really appreciate it. So I've got a slideshow here. Is there a way to get it to switch over? Oh, great.
There it is.
So in the fall of 2019, I had just become a reporter at the New York Times when I discovered a New York-based startup that had done something extraordinary. It had created a facial recognition tool that had scraped billions of photos from the public internet to build a tool that could link somebody based on a snapshot of their face to their name, to their social media profiles, and maybe even to photos of themselves on the internet that they had never seen before. The company was called Clearview AI. And the way I found out about them was through a public records request. The Atlanta Police Department had sent over this 26-page PDF that had that brochure you were just looking at, and also had this memo written by very famous lawyer named Paul Clement that described what Clearview AI had done, and the company was giving this memo to police departments to reassure them that if they used the tool, they wouldn't be breaking state and federal privacy laws. And this was pretty exciting to get in the FOIA. Usually, if you ever do a FOIA or have done FOIAs, you don't always get exciting things. Like oftentimes things are blacked out, but this had this like juicy, privileged, and confidential attorney work product at the top. So I knew right away there was going to be something good in there. At the time I first learned of Clearview AI, their database had 3 billion photos of it in it. Today they have 40 billion photos. It was beyond anything created by the government or even released by the big technology giants. At the time I first learned about Clearview AI, they were primarily selling their tech to law enforcement agencies, but they were keeping what they were doing a secret. When I went to their website, clearview.ai, this is all they had at the time, just artificial intelligence for a better world, and no mention of facial recognition technology. The company didn't initially want to engage with me. They didn't want a big New York Times story about them, even though they had created this tool that it could expose so much about us. The company itself was trying to stay in the shadows. So because people associated with the company wouldn't talk to me, including Paul Clement and Peter Thiel, who I would later discover was an investor in the company, I tracked down police officers who had used the tool. And one of them was Nick Ferrara here. He was a detective in Florida. And he said that he had heard about them on a listserv for financial crimes detectives, and that all he had to do was email the company, and he got a 30-day free trial. And he and other officers told me it worked like nothing they had ever used before. He, at the time, had a stack of kind of photos on his desk of people, fraudsters who had been photographed at an ATM or at a bank counter. And he had run them through the state facial recognition system in Florida that looked through driver's license photos and mugshots, and he hadn't gotten any results. And then he ran the photos through Clearview AI, and he said, I got hit after hit after hit. He said it was amazing, and he would be the company's spokesperson if he could. And so I told him that sounded amazing, and I would really like to see what this looks like. What does this search look like? And so he offered to show me and said, just send me a photo of yourself. And I sent him 3. And then I waited to see the Clearview results. And I just never heard from him. He ghosted me, wouldn't respond to my phone calls or my emails. And something similar happened with other officers. And I eventually found out that the company had put an alert on my face. And even though they weren't talking to me, they were getting a notification when an officer ran a search on my face, and then they would reach out to the officer and tell them, do not talk to her, and threaten to cut off their access to the app. I was stunned, and I wondered, who is this strange company, and how did they build this powerful app? And what I would discover over the course of the book is that the desire to get computers to unlock the human face goes back decades. This is some research that was done in 1965, secretly funded by the CIA. This was happening in Silicon Valley before Silicon Valley was even called Silicon Valley. In the early 1960s, early computer scientists tried to build the first facial recognition system. It did not work that well. It involved one of the researchers' teenage sons and his friend who had to manually, measure things on people's faces. But the technology improved in fits and starts over the decades. And this century, it reached fruition, thanks to more powerful computers, advances in machine learning, and an endless supply of high-resolution photos of faces brought about by digital cameras and the internet. There had been this long chain of people working on solving the problem of unlocking the human face over years and decades, and I interviewed many of them for the book. Everyone in the chain assumed that someone else in the chain would deal with the societal implications of facial recognition once it was perfected. This is not uncommon in the tech space. The concept is often called technical sweetness. based on a quote from Robert Oppenheimer talking about his work on the nuclear bomb. He said, "When you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do about it only after you've had your technical success." Or put another way by the great Dr. Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park, scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. That said, some companies who achieved this sweetness opted not to share it with the world. Before Clearview AI came along, Facebook and Google had developed similar technology internally that could identify a stranger. They deemed it a tool that was too dangerous to release. Clearview's edge was ethical arbitrage. They were willing to release a tool that others hadn't dared to. The company's primary founder was Hoan Ton-Tat, a computer whiz who grew up in Australia and at age 19 dropped out of college to move to San Francisco and chase the tech boom. His experience was building Facebook apps, iPhone quizzes, and an app called Trump Hair. And when I first found out who he was and I Googled him, that bottom left photo was one of the first ones that came up. And I thought, wow, this is going to be a really interesting company. That he was able to go from Facebook quizzes and Trump hair to create this astounding technology speaks to the power of open source technology. The building blocks for powerful AI-based applications are increasingly widely available to anyone with technical savvy. Hoan Ton-Tat acknowledged that chain of AI pioneers who paved the way for him, computer scientists like Geoffrey Hinton, who has been called the godfather of AI. He told me, "I was standing on the shoulders of giants." Facial recognition is on the leading edge of the debate about AI. Technical sweetness has been achieved, and we must now decide what to do about it. Here's what's happening. Police are using Clearview AI and other facial recognition vendors to identify criminal suspects. We're using it at airports and at borders to verify our identities. Casinos can identify high rollers as they approach the doors and turn away cheaters and people with gambling problems. Macy's and grocery stores here in New York are using it to kick out shoplifters. And one of the more troubling deployments in the US, especially for the people in this room, the owner of Madison Square Garden has been using it against his enemies, lawyers, who work at firms that have lawsuits against the company, using their headshots scraped from their firm's own websites. I have seen this happen. I bought Rangers tickets for a personal injury attorney in New York just so I could see what would happen when we walked through the door. We went to Madison Square Garden. There are thousands of people that are streaming into the arena. We walked through the doors, put our bags down on a conveyor belt, and by the time we went to pick them up, a security guard approached her, reminder that I bought the ticket, asked her for her ID. He looked at it and he said, "You are on the ban list. My manager's going to come over. You're not going to be able to come in until your firm drops the suit, or the litigation is resolved." And she said, "I'm not working on that suit. I'm not involved." It's one of my colleagues. Says it doesn't matter. The ban applies to your whole firm. What is unique about facial recognition technology? Our face becomes a key to knowing everything about us, linking ourselves in the real world to what is knowable about us online. It opens up the possibility for a new era of discrimination based on things that are not protected classes, like who you work for or your political beliefs. It's also what is happening at Madison Square Garden. It's also a great example of what's called surveillance creep. Madison Square Garden originally installed facial recognition technology to deal with security concerns, like people who had come in and been violent, gotten into fights, thrown a beer bottle down onto the court. But now it's being repurposed as a way of kind of punishing enemies, discouraging kind of lawful activities. When we create these technological infrastructures for security purposes, the idea is always initially to use it for safety reasons. But once in place, it is often repurposed to monitor opponents, suppress dissent, and discourage other lawful activities. China, which is farther along than we are in the rollout of the technology, did it for safety and security reasons, but now uses it to identify protesters and dissidents, automatically ticket jaywalkers, and control how much toilet paper people can take in public restrooms. The question we face with this particular AI is where we should draw the line. Should police search a database of billions of faces every time a crime is caught on camera? Should the databases be smaller or more localized? Do we have effective systems in place to question the machine's judgment? Because while facial recognition technology is powerful, it still makes mistakes. There are a handful of people who have been arrested for the crime of looking like someone else. Once a system identifies a person, investigators can fall prey to automation bias, where they rely too heavily on the computer's judgment and don't do a thorough enough investigation beyond that. The problems of bias and misidentification have gotten a lot of attention, as they should. It is very traumatic to be arrested for a crime you did not commit. But the technology is improving rapidly and will likely soon work near perfectly. That, coupled with wide deployment, is an even more chilling possible future we must grapple with. Should the facial recognition algorithms be running on all the cameras all the time, as they are in Moscow, allowing police to find missing or wanted persons, but also to identify protesters against the war in Ukraine? Should businesses be identifying us as we walk through the door, able to immediately link us to our online dossiers? Should we in this room be able to recognize one another with Clearview-like software on our phones or in augmented reality glasses? Clearview has already developed such an application, and I've tried these glasses on and looked at the company's spokeswoman, pulled up photos of her, including one with a client that I asked her about, and she said, "Please don't ever report that I'm in a picture with that person. It's not public that I work with that person." And I was shocked because this is a person that's trying to sell this technology to the world, and I had just used it to invade her privacy. Clearview is limited to police, but there are other face search engines with smaller databases available on the internet right now. That technology could mean the end of anonymity as we know it. One of them is a database called PimEyes. It's advertised as a way for you to check your own privacy. You can run your own face. But if you get a subscription to the service, you can run 25 searches a day, and there is no technical measure in place to make sure that you're only searching your own face. This is an example of me running my own face, and you can see the kind of number of pictures that come up. I ran photos of my colleagues with their consent. This is Cecilia. She covers technology policy in DC. She sent me a photo of herself with a COVID mask on. As you can see, it was still able to identify her. My colleague Erin Griffith covers startups, sent me a photo in a hat and sunglasses, still able to identify her. This is how I discovered she used to play in a folk band. My colleague Mark Tracy, facial hair, glasses, and it made matches where I don't even know if I would identify Mark in that top photo. Anyone on the subway, in a restaurant, in a pharmacy could snap your photo and potentially learn who you are. Should face scraping companies have the right to put us and all of our photos scraped from the internet in these searchable databases? Europe, Australia, and Canada have said no, that it violates their privacy laws. But here in the US, the answer to that question is so far mostly yes. You may be feeling hopeless at this point in the talk. And this is where I usually tell people what they can do. PimEyes is allowing people to opt out. So if you search your face and you find photos you don't like, you can get them removed. Unfortunately, there's not much you can do about Clearview. There are some states that have privacy laws that say that you can access and delete the information that a company has about you. This is a great resource from IAPP over here that tracks state laws. Minnesota currently has such a bill in the works, but it hasn't yet passed. So you can't get out of Clearview's database unless you have residency somewhere else, like Virginia or California or Colorado, or a number of these states that have these laws. This is not something, though, that we can confront as individuals. It's a problem that requires a systemic response. And I really don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that that could happen. This isn't the first time we have confronted an invasive technology with scary implications. At the same time, the CIA was funding those early engineers to work on facial recognition in the area not yet known as Silicon Valley, the nation was beset by the electronic listening invasion. Wiretaps and tiny bugs that had Americans worrying that they could never have another private conversation again. The country succeeded in passing regulation to rein in what could be done with that tech. And it's a reason why the vast majority of the surveillance cameras that dot our urban landscape record only our images and not sound. We decided as a country that conversational privacy was important. We can and should choose the future we want, not simply let what technology makes possible dictate it for us. If we think anonymity is important, we will have to protect it.
I'm glad you ended on a high note. I was getting worried there, Kashmir.
I try to be a little happy about things.
So one of the things I really loved about your book is the way it weaves together at least 3 stories at once. So there's a story of a journalist pursuing a story. That's you. There's a story of this eccentric techie and his startup. That's Juan Tat, who we saw the pictures of. And then there's this broader societal story about the deployment of facial recognition technology and what it means. It reminded me in that way of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which is another great privacy book by another talented journalist that does the same thing on those 3 levels.
I love that book.
It's a great book, so it's a nice comparison. So I want to separate out some of those stories. And first I want to talk about the reporting. So I vividly remember reading your original story that exposed the existence of Clearview. As a privacy scholar, is one of those news events that changes the landscape all at once. It reminded me in some ways of Cambridge Analytica or even the Snowden revelations in terms of saying, you know, here's something big that was unknown yesterday and is known today. So you talk in the book about getting the initial tips and starting to understand the story. And I'd like to know a little bit more about that. I wonder how quickly you realized what a bombshell story this was, that I was going to be falling out of my chair when I read it, along with millions of others. And I wonder whether you had any trouble persuading your colleagues and editors of the same thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. For me, as soon as I started reading that PDF from the Atlanta Police Department, I just found it stunning that this had happened, in part because I actually flashed back to 10 years earlier. I had been at this Federal Trade Commission event in DC called, I think it was called Face Facts or something. Let's Face Facts, and it had been about facial recognition technology, which at that point was still pretty unreliable, but was starting to get better. There were companies that were starting to put facial detection in billboards that could detect your gender and your age and show you appropriate ads. Facebook and Google had started rolling out tagging your friends in photos. And so the FTC wanted to have this hearing where everybody got together and talked about whether there should be some rules of the road. And Facebook was there and Google was there and all these little startups, one called SceneTap, that was putting face cameras in bars so that you could check an app and know what the gender ratio was and the age range so you could decide if you want to go to that bar or not. There were privacy professors there and activists and academics. And, you know, most people in that room did not agree about what we should do about facial recognition technology. But what they all said was no one should build an app or a tool that would identify a stranger. And so I just flashed back to that moment when I was reading the memo, and I just knew it was going to be a huge deal. I was, I think, 6 or 7 months pregnant when I first got the tip. So I was 2 months away from going on maternity leave. My editor had just left to go to New York Magazine, so I didn't have an editor. So I had to go to the big boss, and I was like, I have a huge story, and you have to give me an editor because I really need to write it before I go. And so I got this great editor, David Enrich. And I do remember meeting with other people at the Times, and they kind of didn't think it was real. Like, our understanding at that point was that facial recognition technology was not that powerful. We had just done an investigative report at the Times about how police said, yeah, we basically don't use it, like it doesn't really give accurate results. And so some people just didn't believe, what they had done was real. So it was kind of, and then when the person was Juan Tat and what the experience he had, at first I really wondered, is this snake oil? And it took some digging to figure out that what they had created was indeed all too real.
Yeah. So a large part of the book explores the history of facial recognition. You literally go back to Aristotle and then take us up to yesterday. As you assemble this history, did anything surprise you about its development in terms of, you mentioned in your talk, fits and starts? Like, as you looked at the whole arc of the history of facial recognition technology defined broadly, what did you take away from seeing that long view that helps us understand this today?
Well, when I'd seen people write about kind of the history of facial recognition technology before, they really focused on that it was a power that the government wanted, and that the Defense Department was funding it, and the Department of Justice was funding it. But one of the major breakthroughs that kind of scientists had decided it wasn't possible, that computers might not be able to do this, that that facial recognition was like a distinct human intelligence that our brains had evolved to do, and that computers could never do this. That a computer couldn't figure out you were the same person when your hair changed, or your facial hair changed, or you were in different lights or making a different expression, and they had kind of given up on it. And then there was this moment in the late 80s, early 90s, where this one researcher just made this big leap forward that made people believe it was possible again. And that leap forward was not the result of a government, body trying to get this power. It was a ratings company, a company that wanted to know what people were watching on TV. And they wanted to be able to put a camera on top of the television that would figure out who was in the room. So they would know whether it was, grandmother watching a show, or the 6-year-old grandchild, or, the married couple. And it was just so interesting to me that it was surveillance capitalism that kind of boosted facial recognition forward. We really see it over and over again, that it is kind of advertising firms and data brokers that are doing this kind of incredible data collection that is creating such a privacy invasive environment. It's now become the government buying that data from the private brokers, rather than the government doing it themselves.
So you really lucked out with the character of Juan Tat in terms of having a protagonist for your creation story. And it certainly seems like you ended up spending a lot of time with him over different phases of your reporting on this story, including quite late in the book when you do the glasses, In some ways, he seems like almost like a caricature of the extreme tech bro, But I wonder and he's still, from what I can understand, basically thinks that what he did was great, and the Clearview is an excellent thing, and the facial recognition is a wonderful resource. You mentioned technical sweetness. Talk a little more about the personality of somebody that does open that Pandora's box, whether it's him or whether it's others you've encountered in your reporting.
Yeah, with Juan Tat specifically, he is a fascinating person. Really did spend a lot of time with him. Very charming in his way. Kind of a jokester, prankster. Has a kind of a different personality with different people. But in terms of why they opened this box, really, the initial impulses of the Clearview crew were very dark. The idea for it kind of came about at the Republican National Convention where Trump was the nominee. And Juan Tat was there with a friend of his, and they're wandering the crowd, it's thousands of people. And they were there. He was part of the MAGA crew. He was a Trump supporter, which was unusual because he lived in Brooklyn, and he would walk around with like a red MAGA cap and a big white fur coat, and people just assumed he was being ironic. But he was serious. He was really into Trump. And so he and his friend are wandering around the RNC, and they started thinking, man, it would be great if you had a smartphone app that you could hold up and you could know who here is a friend and who's a foe. And the first time that the technology that became Clearview AI was deployed was at the Deplorable, which was this party to celebrate Trump's becoming president in D.C., and they wanted to be able to keep out liberals. They were worried that liberals were going to come and spy on them or try to ruin the party. And so they were trying to figure out who the liberals were. And one of the first places that they pitched the technology was Hungary as a means for border control. That Hungary's leader, Viktor Orban, who Steve Bannon has called Trump before Trump, really dislikes George Soros and the Open Society Foundations. And so in their pitch to Hungary, they said, we've like fine-tuned the software so that it will recognize anybody who's associated with the Open Society Foundations. You can keep them out or kind of apprehend them at the border. And these are, democracy activists, human rights activists. So this is kind of what they were thinking initially with this technology. It was a way to decide, us versus them, like very polarizing, very, very divisive. So in that way, I almost feel like it's a reassuring tale, the whole book, that's kind of what Juan was imagining initially, and that what Clearview became was a way to, solve crimes and find child molesters. In that way, I mean, I don't think a lot of people read it that way, but it is kind of reassuring that the arc of the technology was for good, at least in the U.S. deployment of it so far.
Yeah. I want to talk more about that in a minute, but first I want to talk about race and gender, and start thinking of questions, folks. So you hear a lot in discussion of AI in general, facial recognition in particular, about embedded racial and gender bias. And I thought one of the most dramatic and harrowing parts of your book was when you discussed the wrongful arrest of Robert Williams, who's a black man who was mistakenly identified by a facial recognition program as a person covered by a warrant. I also remember reading about that in the Times when you first reported it. The implication is that facial recognition is inherently racially biased, and you hear that a lot. But later on in the book, you also note, and you mentioned in your talk, that most of the algorithms, including Clearview's, have dramatically improved their accuracy when it comes to identifying the faces of people of color, even though that had been a serious shortcoming earlier. And I was struck by the privacy activist you quoted who says he worries that maybe we led with our chin when we talked as much as we did about race and gender bias, because the racial injustice of facial recognition is important, but the code is getting so much better now. So at the same time, there's clearly a racial element to the Williams arrest. So I'm wondering about race in terms of the officers versus the algorithm. And even though the code is getting better, it seems like there's still potentially difficulties. How should we think about the potential racial inequities in facial recognition going forward?
Yeah, this is a fraught question. And for a long time, facial recognition technologies were biased. I don't know if you remember the slide I showed, but it was that first paper in 1965, and it had photos of the men that they tested the facial recognition on, and it was all men, and they were all white. And that happened for decades. The faces that were being used to train the technology here in the US, it was often men, it was often white men, and so the technology worked best on them. But this is really a solvable problem. You have more diverse training data, and then the algorithms work better. They become more equitable, and a lot of the good algorithms now, and there's lots of different algorithms, like every company makes their own algorithm, the good ones perform almost equally well on all groups. That said, even if you have a perfect facial recognition algorithm, you will still have racist outcomes. And part of that is that surveillance tools are unevenly distributed, and they're used on some groups more than others. When I showed you that slide of everyone we know of who has been wrongfully arrested, every case so far that we know of that's public, and there are certainly others where people haven't come forward for a variety of reasons, but it's been somebody who is black, and mostly black men. And so, one problem with facial recognition technology is it does work quite well if you have the person you're looking for in the database, which is not always the case. And when you have a very high resolution, good quality photo that you give the system. So you can give a very powerful facial recognition system a very grainy surveillance tape still, and it's not going to work that well, and you're more likely to get a false identification. What happened in most of those arrests is another flaw that can happen with these systems, which is that you run the facial recognition system, you get a match, and then the police will take that match to an eyewitness, and they'll put the match in a 6-pack photo lineup, and they'll ask the eyewitness, "Hey, does anybody here look like, the person who assaulted you?" And they will agree with the computer. I mean, this computer just went through millions or billions of faces and identified the person who looked the most like the suspect. And so you're very likely to get the eyewitness to say, yeah, that's the person who looks like the suspect. So it's really like a terrible circular logic that happens. And some police departments have said, okay, we shouldn't arrest anyone anymore based on a facial recognition system paired with an eyewitness match, because the computer and the human are making the same mistake. And this is something I really worry about when we talk about AI tools in general, and not just facial recognition, is that we'll often say there's a human in the loop. And the human in the loop will make sure that the AI doesn't make a mistake. But you oftentimes have a human who's not capable of checking the system. Right. And so that is not a way to solve some of these problems.
Sure, and you have a human in the loop who is, right, so of the 6 photos that were shown, the wrongfully arrested person looks the most like the suspect, but because the AI said so, but not close enough to be the person. Yeah.
And so, so if we do want police using facial recognition, we do need to have rules in place to make sure that they are doing more investigating of somebody before arresting them than just facial recognition and an eyewitness. And then there's all these other questions. Should they get a warrant to get a facial recognition, to do a facial recognition search? Massachusetts has said yes. And then just knowing like how many searches are they running? How well does this work in the field? It works very well under test conditions, but yeah, how often are they getting a match? How often are they getting the wrong match? It's just all this data that we really should have to make these decisions about how widely these tools should be used.
Right. So towards the end of the book, you have a quote that really jumped out at me, and it's somewhat similar to some of the ways you ended your talk today. So in this part of the book, you're watching police using facial recognition in Miami, and you draw the lesson, pretty much what you just said. There's still many shortcomings to this in actual operation. And then you close the chapter by saying, quote, "We have only the rickety scaffolding of the panopticon, and it's not yet fully constructed. We still have time to decide whether or not we actually want to build it." So I wonder if that's still true. I mean, you know that some legal academics, like my friend Woody Hartzog at BU, have taken the position and written op-eds saying, just ban it outright. I wonder if you think a ban like that would be possible in the United States, and also whether you think it would be a good idea in the United States.
I don't think a ban is going to happen. I think the ship has sailed on that. And that I would say, I mean, I guess I'd ask the people in this room, like, do you think that police should have access to facial recognition technology to solve crimes? I'll go with Jonathan Zittrain says he doesn't like to put people on the spot by making them raise their hands, but you can hum, like, if you think that they should have access to facial recognition. It's a silent room. I'm surprised. Most rooms that I'm in, when I ask, should police be able to use this, they say yes. Like if somebody has committed a crime and this is a tool that can help find them, I want them to use it. But again, there's the question of how big should the database be? Like, you guys are in the lineup. If you have photos on the internet, you're in the lineup every time somebody runs a Clearview AI search. Should you be? Should it be for every crime? Should it be shoplifting and murder and home invasions and jaywalking? Like, what crimes do we want this apply to? There's so many questions. And then there's that question of, do we want facial recognition on all the cameras all the time so they can find somebody, a missing child, a fugitive? And it's interesting, like Europe has really been leading on the privacy question, but in the recent AI Act, they did make an exemption. They kind of said, they basically explicitly said that what Clearview AI did was illegal, that you shouldn't be scraping public information to create a big facial recognition database. But they also said there should be an exemption to do live, real-time face searches in exceptional cases, like there's a missing child or there's a terrorist on the loose. So they've now created the possibility that they're going to start. They can do that. I mean, they've made it legal. So to be pretty standard that and right now facial recognition in real time, unless you're walking into mass.
So let's back off the about law enforcement use. It made me think of conversational privacy law you were referring to at the. If they get judicial permission of some kind, there's a lot of details there, but they at least have to get permission. And if you are not a police officer, you can't do this. Would that work?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we have in Illinois.
Right.
And I mean, I do think something like that works. I gave you the example of Madison Square Garden and how they're using facial recognition to keep lawyers out of, MSG, Radio City Music Hall. Famously, a mother was trying to take her daughter's Girl Scout troop to see the Rockettes Christmas show, and she got turned away because she was a lawyer. Beacon Theater. But Madison Square Garden also owns a theater in Chicago. But they can't use facial recognition technology to keep lawyers out of that venue because of this law. And I tell the history of the law in the book. Illinois decided that if companies want to use your biometrics, your face print, your voice print, your fingerprints, that they have to get consent. And if they don't, they have to pay a very big fine. And that seems to have worked pretty well to protect people in Illinois. And I kind of suspect that's a way that if we got federal, some kind of federal law that applied to this is one way that we would go, where if corporations want to do this to us as we walk through the door, if they want to know what our political beliefs are or who we work for or how rich we are or what it is we're likely to buy when we walk in, that they couldn't do that without our consent.
You mentioned in the book at one point Gary Steingart's Super Sad True Love Story, which is a dystopian novel that imagines the scenario you're talking about. People have scores that pop up when you look at them. And that seems like a really apt example.
Yeah, and I mean, happening in China, and a lot of protesters say that this has been used against them, that, like you go to a protest and then police show up at your door the next day, or even sometimes that you don't get access to certain services like public transportation because you're being punished for these acts of rebellion.
So I'm going to ask one more question and encourage folks to go to the mics for yours. And here's my question, which does not have to do with facial recognition. You're on the technology dystopia beat. What's the next thing that scares you?
I mean, right now I'm steeped in car data. I was talking about this at lunch with some students, but I mean, I found out that cars, I did not find out that cars are smartphones on wheels, but cars are smartphones on wheels. And some of the automakers have decided they can collect information from you about like how do you brake, how fast you take corners, how rapidly you accelerate, how the distance that you're driving, as long as you kind of agree to it in privacy policies, that they could collect it and sell it, and it was making its way to the insurance industry, and it was resulting in people paying higher rates, and they had no idea that their car was reporting that kind of data. I guess this year I'm kind of looking at what are other unexpected privacy grabs that are resulting in us paying more. We've gotten to a place where if it's kind of hidden away in the privacy policy, there are crazy things that can happen with your data. And I really think that industry has come to fruition now because we've allowed it to. Privacy professors have been writing about this for a long time, about what might happen, and it feels like we're now at the point where it is happening.
Right. Questions? Don't be shy. Go ahead, Alan. Others too. There's another microphone.
Yeah, we do have, it's recorded, so there's microphones.
Yeah, exactly. As I mentioned,
heard.
we want to use the mics so that the folks at home, hello, can hear what we say.
So I'm curious what you think about, or whether you're optimistic that the courts will be of much help in trying to regulate this technology. On the one hand, one might imagine that judges will be very sensitive to this technology. I think there's a long tradition of courts protecting privacy when they realize that the technology at issue could affect their own privacy, and obviously facial recognition really doesn't know any demographic or educational boundaries. On the other hand, there's a recent strain in constitutional law with respect to the First Amendment that views data as a kind of First Amendment speech. And there's no denying the fact that facial recognition software is not just data, but it's data that's very information rich and can often lead to interesting findings and discourse and the things that the First Amendment really likes. And yet, if the First Amendment were to protect this, we're that much closer to the dystopian hellscape that you write so vividly about in your reporting. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not theoretical. After I wrote about Clearview AI, initially there was a lot of litigation, a lot of privacy lawsuits that were filed. Clearview, of their many defenses, one was the First Amendment. They hired a very famous First Amendment attorney, Floyd Abrams, to represent them, who also represented the New York Times when we were being prohibited from publishing the Pentagon Papers. I'm really a lion of the field. And they argue that what they're doing is what Google does. That in the same way that you can Google someone's name and find everything on the internet about them that has their name in it, Clearview says, we're just allowing you to search with someone's face and showing you public photos of them. We're not hacking anyone's Facebook account, or not going into Dropbox and pulling private material out. This is all public. We simply kind of reorganize the internet by face, which I don't think most of us who were putting our photos on the internet over the last couple decades foresaw that was going to happen. But they said, yeah, everything that we do is public. And they have tried that defense in a number of their cases. Most of the litigation class action lawsuits got consolidated in Illinois. And Floyd Abrams made that argument to the judge. The ACLU made a different argument. They said that this kind of search of somebody potentially threatens their First Amendment rights and their ability to assemble, and that the U.S., a state can regulate the use of a biometric. And the judge ended up agreeing with the ACLU. This was just kind of in the initial stages. The case ultimately settled. But the judge says, Clearview, you are welcome. You can scrape the photos. You can give people results, but you can't use a person's biometric to search the photos. You could do it by hand. You could hire 5,000 people to look through the photos if you want, but you don't have the right to use somebody's biometric material. So it didn't really work for them. But yeah, I'm curious. None of these cases have gone kind of all the way through to a trial. None of them have gone to an appeals court or to the Supreme Court. I don't know how the courts would ultimately rule on this, but it is complicated that it's ultimately public information on the internet. In Europe, privacy regulators have said just because it's public doesn't mean it's not private, but we haven't really taken that tack here.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you one more question. Is all of this really, and your last answer actually suggests your possible response, how much of this is just about scale, right? Like how it scales? Something that is maybe so minimally intrusive that we don't have a problem with it at a small scale becomes the dystopian hellscape, to use our questioner's phrase, at scale. Can you tell a lot of these stories around that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is about scale. I really do. And I think people are comfortable with facial recognition when it's more limited. When it's a one-to-one facial recognition match, like with your with your, phone. If you're unlocking your phone, it has a photo of you that's on the phone. It's matching to your face. I think even a lot of people are comfortable at the border right now using it. I went to Italy for my book tour, and I had the experience for the first time of boarding a United flight and didn't have to show my boarding pass. The flight attendant just held up a phone and scanned my face and said, "You're welcome to get on." So clearly they had built a small database of everyone they knew was coming on the plane, I assume from the passport that I uploaded into the app when I checked in. But I think we're comfortable with like a small use of our face. But this idea that anybody, can take a photo of you and then see everything that's, up on the internet about you.
Yeah. Do you use Face ID to unlock your phone?
I do, yeah.
Yeah. And why is that something you're comfortable with even after writing this book?
Because I guess I trust Apple
Sure.
in terms of, that the face recognition is happening on device as opposed to in a cloud, and that the database isn't being repurposed for something else.
Which they've said pretty clearly, by the way. So I want to thank you for making your way out to Minnesota to share your book with us. I'm suspecting that the weather in Italy might have been superior to the weather you're experiencing outside here today. But please join me in thanking Kashmir Hill for her presentation. And as I said before, there's a reception and a book available in the hall. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm here. If you prefer to ask questions one-on-one, I'm happy to answer them. And I do have 25 PIM-eyes searches. So if anybody wants to see their personalized facial recognition results, I'm happy to show them to you.
Thank you very much.